Hi, you've tuned in to the Sunday message from Sunnyhill Church, Ferndown. To learn more about us, including our gathering times, midweek groups, plus other messages and content, visit us online at sunnyhill.church/Ferndown. We believe you'll be blessed and transformed as you listen today.
Everyone okay? Yeah? How are we doing with the this On Purpose series? Good? Yeah? So what have we had so far? We've had designed on purpose. We've had, I'm cheating because I've got these in front of me. We've had developing on purpose. We've had deployed on purpose. We've had destined on purpose. We've got dangerous on purpose. I think I've got the best one so far. Okay? Disciplined on purpose. Yeah? I don't know, whenever, I know Adam has this as well, whenever God gets me to speak on anything, he kind of always gets me to live it, normally the week before. Thank you, Adam. So, disciplined, and so I did that, and part of the discipline was quite a lot of perseverance and endurance. It was quite a difficult week. And then God blessed me even more by postponing it a week, so I got 2 weeks of it. But you know what? I was ready last week to give this word, but actually I was realizing that this week, it's kind of difficult to explain more ready, but just imagine marinated, in this. And so I'm really looking forward to be able to give this. Are we enjoying the summer at the moment? It's kind of like it's spring, but it feels like summer, doesn't it? And I've actually been noticing the trees. Now, I'm not a guy that normally goes out and says, "Oh, look, the trees." I'm not normally that kind of guy, but I have been noticing the trees. And so I just want you to imagine for a moment your favorite tree, if you have one. If you don't have one, there is a tree. Helps with the imagination. Yeah. And you know what? Those trees, they've at some point been planted, and water comes to it, and the sunlight, it comes to it. Does the tree actually need to do anything? Yeah. Someone said grow. I don't know who, but someone said grow. The tree does have to do stuff. It does have to grow. It has to grow roots. It has to grow leaves to be able to catch the sunlight, to be able to get in the CO2, to be able to do photosynthesis, and this is sounding like a biology class. But it does have to do something. But you know what trees don't do? Do trees ever form a committee and then decide, you know what, we haven't got enough water, we need to build a dam? Maybe we outsource this to some beavers and we can build a dam. No, trees don't gather around and start deciding to do that. Do trees form research committees and decide, work out ways to increase the nuclear fusion of the sun to be able to increase more sunlight? Why not? Because they're trees. They can't do that. And, trees, their purpose is actually to grow and to multiply. They grow until they really can't grow much more, and then they produce seeds which multiply them to other places. That's their purpose. And you know what? If they started wasting time putting all of their resources into something that they can't actually do at all, then they wouldn't actually fulfill the purpose which actually they're there for. And you know what? We can actually learn a lesson from that. Because it says in Jeremiah, "But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him." By trusting in God, it's letting God bring the things to us that actually only God can actually do. It says, those whose confidence are in him, they will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots into the stream. It does not fear when the heat comes. By the way, the heat will come. It's not a case of if the heat comes, it's going to come. Because life is tough and life is difficult, but it's not afraid. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries of the year of drought. It's not just a bit of heat. The year of drought is an entire year of drought, but it is not worried. And it never fails to bear fruit. The thing is, though, that trees aren't actually disciplined, because a tree can't actually, the tree's got to sit there and wait for the water to come to it and wait for the sunlight to come to it. And by the way, let's just consider that for a moment. Think about like those shots that we see now with drones looking down upon all the forests and the like. Imagine like one tree. How much sunlight is there on a sunny day for that one tree? How much rain, when it rains, actually pours, does that tree actually need? There is a superabundance of light, there is a superabundance of water for this tree. But they're not disciplined because, unlike us, they don't have the freedom to move. We are able to move, we're able to think, we're able to go and gather, we're able to problem solve, we're able to develop solutions to things. We're different because we have more ability than a tree. And with that comes greater responsibility. And that responsibility is that we need to choose to use our abilities, yes, but not to actually depend on our own abilities as a substitute for what actually God is to do. And that is a discipline. We actually have to be disciplined in the way that we use our abilities. You see, if we start relying on our own abilities, we start investing in changing the things that we cannot change. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of my time quite often thinking and worrying about things that I've got no control over whatsoever. And it's honestly a complete waste of time. We worry about what might be. We imagine things which aren't there. God spent a couple of weeks with me on just imaginings, things that I were imagining, and that he showed me afterwards, it was never there in the first place, yet I wasted all this energy. And you know what? We grow impatient, and so we try and use our own abilities to make something happen in a timing that's our choosing, rather than in God's choosing. So the take-home message is, let him bring to you what he wants to give to you. Because the alternative is that we strive to bring about what only God will let us have if we let him give it to us. Think about this for a moment. It's a little bit like when we take on these things, these worries and concerns, it's like taking on extra baggage. And Paul sort of talked a little bit when he was talking to the Philippians. He said, "No, dear brothers and sisters, I have not achieved it." Let me pause there. That's a real encouragement because, Paul is like Mr. Disciplined, okay? And Paul gets to this stage in his life, he is like super evangelist. He's gone and planted umpteen churches. He is supporting them at the moment. He doesn't know this yet, but he's going to be the writer of most of the New Testament. And yet he says at this point, "I have not achieved it." So, we can be encouraged. But I focus on this one thing, forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, is calling us. Now just imagine if you're going to run a race and someone says, "Oh, by the way, here's this backpack I want you to just take on, and here's a suitcase, I want you to take that as well. Now run the race." It's going to be hard. In fact, it might be so hard that we don't actually manage to finish the race and get done all that actually God has purposed for us to do. So stop trying to do yourself what God is wanting to give you. But speaking about Paul, actually, Mr. Disciplined, other than Jesus, if we were going to think about someone in the New Testament who works out and lives out disciplined, I reckon Paul is probably the guy. And so what we're going to do is just take a little bit of a look at some of Paul's life towards the end of Acts. So this is a bit of spoilers for whenever we get back to doing the Acts series, apologies. But we're going to start at kind of this point here. So it's in chapter 19, verse 21. He says, after all this has happened, there's a load of stuff that had gone down in Ephesus, which is where Paul is at the moment. Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. And after I have been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. Now, just a bit of a thing. Basically, the rest of Acts from this verse onwards is pretty much describing Paul's journey to Rome. Okay? And just to sort of give you, probably can't see the map really well, this is what is now Turkey, this is Greece, this is Italy. And at the moment, Paul is here in Ephesus. But I'm going to venture to suggest that Paul probably didn't just decide to go to Rome when he was in Ephesus. He probably had this in mind for a while. So if we go back a little while, he was in Corinth. Now, Corinth is located around about there. Greece is kind of broken up into two main land masses, and there's like a land bridge that connects them. Corinth sat on that land bridge. And as a result of that, it's like the international port where you could basically land your ship that side or the other side and transport your goods across. So it became a major trading hub, but it also became a major port. So, if you are Paul and you are in the major port of the empire and you decide to go to the empire's capital, it's not hard. You catch a boat, basically from Corinth, you go along, there's a little bit of water there, you go along the coast and up to Rome. I reckon if you stopped off a few times, you're probably looking at a couple of weeks. If you didn't, days to be able to accomplish that. Mission accomplished. What does Paul actually do? Paul decides he's going to go this way. He starts around here, and rather than going cutting across here, he actually is going around. If you could see this, you'd actually see that there are some names of some churches that we might recognize, Thessalonica, Pergamum, Samaria, and eventually he winds up in Ephesus. But he's going around and he's strengthening the churches that he's already planted. He does it the harder way. And he's in Ephesus. And when he's in Ephesus, in fact, actually, I've made this a little bit too brief. He actually stops off on a number of other ways on the way to Jerusalem. Why does he do this? He does this, and it is the harder way. But he does this because he knows by going this way, he's going to bring more glory to God. Why? Because he is strengthening God's people, and he's bringing God's word. But God says to him all along the way, if you go to Jerusalem, you are going to get arrested. If you go to Jerusalem, you are going to be bound, put in chains, put in prison. In fact, there are people all along the way that are saying to him, you don't want to do this. This is the wrong thing. You shouldn't be doing this. Don't go to Jerusalem. But Paul is absolutely convinced that this is where God is leading him. He has a choice. Now, I just want to talk a bit about choices, okay? I think sometimes as Christians, because we know, there is God, and there's kind of the devil and the rest of the world, there's kind of like, it feels like we are surrounded by like binary choices which are right or wrong, that there is a right choice and a wrong choice. And sometimes that is absolutely true. Do I lie? Do I tell the truth? Well, the truth is God's way, so there's a definite right and wrong. Do I steal? Do I not steal? I don't steal. There's a right and the wrong. But there are also like free choices. Do I put on a blue t-shirt today? Do I put on a red t-shirt today? It doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter. And, I don't commit a sin by choosing not to put on the red t-shirt. You might think that I have by putting on the shorts. That's up to you. But, the t-shirt, it doesn't matter. And you know what? Sometimes there are some really big choices out there, and God will say to you, you can choose left, you can choose right, and I will bless you either way. I once knew a lady a while back. She came from New Zealand. She'd lived a while over here, and it was almost the last time I spoke to her, actually. She came to me, and I didn't speak to her often, but I happened to be talking to her over the phone, and she said, I am really struggling with hearing from God about whether I go back to New Zealand or not. This is like a big choice. And she said, I've got nothing. I've been praying and I'm hearing nothing. And I really felt convicted that the response I gave her was absolutely not what she wanted to hear. It was basically, you can choose. You can go to New Zealand and I will bless you, says God. You can stay here and I will bless you. That's a big choice. And there are huge ramifications. But it was a free choice. And there are some choices which are like good and better. And there are other choices which are like bad and worse. But let's go with the good and better. It's a good choice to choose to come to church today, now, to be here. But it might be a better choice to come to church and to serve. But it's not like you've done something terrible if you aren't serving, because you come to church and that is good. And what Paul is faced with here is like a good and better choice. The good choice is a good choice to go to Rome. This is great. And if he had chosen just to go to Rome, that would have been fine. But it was a better choice to go the harder way. Why? Because in this case, he is basically going against the worldly currents in God's power, and he is achieving more in God's power, and that is bound to get God the glory. So you know what? When he calls you, it isn't going to be easy, and it isn't going to always go right. But you know what? That isn't failure. That's just a call to perseverance. And actually, in a sense, it didn't go right is a matter of perspective. It didn't go the way I planned is probably quite accurate, but it didn't go right may not be so true. You see, if we never get anything wrong, we kind of never learn anything. So we learn by our mistakes. We don't enjoy it, but it's a thing, like discipline. You know, if we never try anything new, we'll always get what we always got. We want to change, then we're going to have to do something differently. And you know what? When we try something new, we're normally rubbish at it at start, and eventually we get better. So, you know, this is what Paul said to the Galatians. He said, "Rather I am a sinner if I rebuild the old system of the law I already tore down. For when I tried to keep the law, it condemned me. So I died to the law. I stopped trying to meet all its requirements." This is what only God can do. Think tree. "So I might live for God." This is what I can do. And you might remember when we looked at Galatians a while back, we looked at the difference between living in grace and living by the law. I'm actually going to provide like a third option, which is kind of the way that the rest of the world lives. You've kind of got lawless living, which is where you basically have no rules. You just choose to do whatever you want. So there's no discipline there at all. You've got kind of like law-based living, which is sort of more enforced discipline. And I just want to kind of speak into that for a moment, because we do live with a law, but the law is pretty light touch, deliberately, in fact, because the law of the land actually came about originally when this country was Christ-centered, and actually the law is designed to affect about 1% of the population to keep them in line, and for 99%, it kind of doesn't. We don't think, have I robbed a bank today? No, I'm okay. Have I killed anyone today? No. We don't have to worry about those things, but Jewish law was different. Jewish law that was passed by God to Moses actually was pretty invasive, and it was difficult. In fact, it was so difficult that they couldn't keep it. In fact, the evidence of the law was to show man you can't be perfect. You can't do it God's way by yourself. And so what we have instead is grace living. By the blood of Jesus, we actually are now called to self-discipline. Now, in some respects, self-discipline is immediately a little bit harder to do, but it's much better in the long run, because we are called to respond to what we've been called to in love. Because, you know, God has designed us on purpose to be required to be disciplined intentionally. And it actually goes hand in hand with the freedom that he's granted us through grace. So let's just recap this a second and actually just unpack this a little bit. We've got the law, which is more structured, but it's more restrictive and less productive. It's more structured in the sense that it says, do this, do this, do this, do that. Yeah? And then sometimes that feels quite comfortable. But this is how man interacts with the law. He kind of looks at the law and says, yeah, I've done that. Yeah, I've done that. Yeah, I've done that. Oh, I'm good. I've done it. You see, it works out. We actually start trying to earn our salvation. We start trying to earn our place with God. And what's better, we get to measure our success and be able to see how good we are. Conversely, other people get to look at us and say how bad we are. And so we end up with a society based entirely on judgment. But you know what? It actually is quite limiting, because we say, yeah, I've done that, I'm good. Don't have to do anymore. I've done the bits that I think I'm supposed to do. And we kind of draw the line there. By comparison, we've got grace-based living, which is much less structured. We're called to please God. okay, how do I do that? You know, it's not immediately necessarily obvious, but you know what? It's free and empowering. Why is it freeing and empowering? Because by the law, we were all about trying to earn our way to be able to get to God. With grace, we start off with freedom is granted. We've succeeded, not because we've done anything, but because Jesus has done it for us. He has granted us our success. And now we are called to respond to the life that we've been given. And that is a call to meet our full potential. Not just the checklist, but actually it opens it us and it empowers us to be able to fill our potential to whatever we've been called to. You know, we're looking to change. You know, this is the whole point of this entire, of this series, is that we're being called to change, so we're kind of going to need to do something different. And it's on purpose. So we're being called to do so intentionally. So we're kind of going to have to be deliberate. This change isn't going to happen isn't going to happen all on its own. We've actually got to do something, and therefore we need a plan. And you know, the problem with plans is that you actually have to follow them, and the problem with following a plan is that you kind of have to be disciplined to it. So, end of that section. If you're writing down, by the way, new section. Believing, okay, if you want a little subheading. Before we have to start dealing with everything that's out there, let's start worrying about what's actually going on inside, because it turns out that that bit's more important. And to do that, we're going to actually just skip forward a little bit to Paul's story. So, right, Paul has gone to Jerusalem. He's gone to Jerusalem, and just as it has been prophesied, he has been arrested, and he has been put in prison. He has been in prison for a while. In fact, he was carted from Jerusalem to Caesarea because in Jerusalem it was so dangerous to him to be there that he needed, well, God basically employed the biggest army in the world at the time to protect him, and he was imprisoned but protected by the Roman Empire in Caesarea, where he's basically with a guy called Festus, who is the governor of the area, the province. And Festus is kind of using Paul a little bit like entertainment. He loves listening to Paul. But the thing is that Festus is, well, he's in a difficult situation because he's a Roman governor. He doesn't understand Judaism at all, and he doesn't understand what Paul is going on about. But Paul is required to have his case heard. And so there's this moment a little bit later when this guy, King Agrippa, comes to visit. Now this is great for Festus because King Agrippa is well versed in the scriptures. He understands all about Judaism and actually professes to believe the scriptures in the Old Testament, which is great. So King Agrippa arrives. Now, at this point, I should say, Acts is written by a guy called Luke, and Luke must have been here at this time because Luke makes little comments like Paul makes a gesture with his hands. And that kind of means that Luke kind of had to be there to see that. And the thing is, that right at the very beginning, Luke describes that King Agrippa arrived in pomp and splendor. So just imagine it's like, get the red carpet, you know, the trumpets sound, and in comes the man, and he sits down. And he listens to Paul's case. And you know what? Paul's actually quite pleased that Agrippa's here because he knows that Agrippa understands these things too. And so Paul does what Paul does best. He evangelizes and he gives this case for Jesus being the Messiah. And he marries it up with the prophets and what the prophets prophesy. And so we get to this point. And Paul is talking here now. He's talking actually to Festus about King Agrippa, but to Agrippa as well. And he says, if King Agrippa knows about these things, I speak boldly, for I am sure that these events are all familiar to him, for they were not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. And Agrippa interrupts him. He says, do you think you can persuade me to become a Christian so quickly? Or in another translation, it goes more like, you know, a little more and I'll become a Christian. And it's kind of like there's a lot going on behind the scenes here, really, in Agrippa's life. You see, he's got this choice, and it's a bit awkward. Paul is painting him into a corner. You see, Agrippa, on the one hand, believes the prophets, and Paul has just put this really, really compelling case to say that Jesus is the Messiah according to the prophets. The problem is that if Agrippa says, yes, I believe the prophets and I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, he then loses all favor with the Jewish authorities that are in Jerusalem. All the pomp and the splendor and all of the status that he's enjoyed is basically centered upon those people in Jerusalem. And so he loses reputation. But he's got another problem. If he turns around and says, no, I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, he's got a witness in Festus, who's basically can say, well, wait a minute, you say that you believe the prophets, but now you don't believe the prophets? So in a sense, he is in danger of saying that one of two things. Either these guys weren't prophets, or even worse, they were prophets, they are giving the word of God, but they don't believe it. And so he receives reputational damage, ironically, from the same people. Either way, he loses his reputation, and he loses his lifestyle. So he chooses to interrupt Paul and effectively postpone the decision. He doesn't have to make one. And you know what? We do the same. When we don't like it, when God is putting us into an awkward situation, one of our strategies to avoid this is to kind of say, yeah, okay, my purpose, that does sound really important. Yes, I'll nod and agree. That is, I do need to worry about that. But, later. I'll worry about it later. You see, contrary to what Agrippa professed, he believed that his lifestyle was more important than what God was saying through the prophets. And what I'm about to say next might be a bit uncomfortable, might even be offensive, I don't know. But it is a bit of a reality check. We don't often fully believe what we say we do. And that's because the way that we act does not always match what we profess. We come to church and we gather together and we profess things that are all true. We know they are true. We convince ourselves that actually, yes, we do believe them. But the way that we act afterwards is not the same. In a sense, it's a bit like, you remember when James said, I look in the mirror and then I go away and kind of forget the way I look. It's worse. We don't look at a mirror. We look at a well-drawn portrait of ourselves and think that is the way that we are and convince ourselves I don't need to do anything and away we go. We're not even looking at the image and forgetting it. We have it in our mind what we actually are like and go away. And there's a problem with this. It's hypocrisy at the end of the day. We say we believe one thing and actually we do another. And here's the problem with hypocrisy. You can't go and tell someone you're being hypocritical because we kind of believe ourselves. We believe ourselves, our own image. And so you kind of have to expose hypocrisy. So, how does God do this? Well, how does he do it with Agrippa? He basically gives us tests. Okay? And in this case, he basically tests Agrippa to see what Agrippa will choose. I don't know if you've ever wondered why life is so hard. And we become a Christian, and at the end of the day we think, well, now God's on our side. He's the ruler and the king of everything. Surely everything should go fine. And we realize pretty quickly, no, life's still very hard. Why is it hard? It's hard because the answer is that he's trying to develop our faith. You see, Peter said about this, these trials, the things that are hard in our life, will show that your faith is genuine. It's being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. So that it's not just a test, but it's also an active process in our life. It's purifying. Though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. You see, it's about spiritual growth. And to God, spiritual growth is enormously, enormously important. And let's actually pause for a moment. Why is it so important? It's so important because actually it's about eternity. Most of what we think about and do in our lives is kind of transitory. It's actually about a temporary thing. Food is important. And, our jobs are important, yeah. But actually, God's purposes for our lives have eternal impact, and the way that we interact with people, and when we do what God is asking us to do and fulfill our purpose, these are eternal things. And discovering your purpose, which God has for you right now, will impact eternity. You see, what we do here on earth is a foundation on which God will build in eternity. It's not kind of like the end when we die here. That's the foundation. And in eternity, God will use that foundation. And the bigger the foundation, the bigger the house, and the greater the glory that we bring him. So how do tests work? Well, it kind of goes a little bit like this. We have the Holy Spirit inside of us. He is guiding us along the best pathway of our life. That's Psalm 32. And so he's guiding us in one direction. And we have, on the other hand, we live in the world, and we've got our flesh. And so we've got the Holy Spirit kind of guiding us in one direction. We've got the world that is very definitely opposed to that, pushing in the opposite direction, and we are in the middle. And we get squeezed. Why is that good? Well, kind of a little bit like the toothpaste. It's squeezed, and eventually we see what comes out. And it might be in our heads, we think, oh yeah, there's toothpaste in that tube, and actually what comes out looks a lot less like toothpaste. We have in our heads, this is the way that we are, and this is what we believe, but when we're put under pressure, we actually get exposed what we actually believe. See, when this happened to Agrippa, he chose that his lifestyle was more important than the discovery of what the Messiah might actually mean for him. And we can diagnose our own spiritual health by our decisions. What is most important? Don't be deceived by, I'm too busy. This I'm too busy thing is actually a construct that's been created by the enemy, placed in the world to make sure that we are too busy with the things that are actually transient. And we're meant to think that they are really important because, let's face it, our jobs are important. It's our livelihood. Of course it's important. But it's not more important than the eternal things of God. But it's set up so that we're busy, so that it's set up in competition to the things that God says are important. And I tell you what, whatever is most important to you, that is what will happen. So if you think the things that are busy are important, you'll make those the most important. Whatever is most important in your life, you will choose to do. So if you're going to choose to do something, then stick to it. Make a date. This is kind of why in what we're doing in small groups, why Adam's talking about setting a goal and being accountable. Because actually that kind of forces us to say, what is most important? I will make the time for that. And if it's in competition with something else, then whatever is most important will win out. So make the choice. If we believe it's important enough, then we will do what we must do to put the disciplines in place to make the necessary differences to change. You know what? Change actually happens instantly. All of you are thinking, wait a minute, he's not supposed to say that. It does. Change happens instantly, but the problem is it lasts for a little while and it changes back again. So we revert back to what we would normally do. New Year's resolutions are the perfect example. We resolve to do something, it lasts days, weeks, at best till February. And then we revert back. What we're actually looking for is permanent change, but that happens over time. And permanent change means doing things differently in a consistent way and often, and it means building up good habits, but it means having the discipline to choose to make the sacrifices to sustain them. And then we're brought to the last bit, being blown off course. Paul is he gets what he wants in the end, or what he's looking for. You see, actually there's a point where Jesus actually appears to him. And he says to Paul, he's only been in prison in Jerusalem for a little while, and Jesus appears and he says, you are going to go to Rome and to preach. And actually, this becomes a really important hope anchor to Paul. So what happens? He eventually appeals to Caesar, and he's being then carted across the Mediterranean on his way to Rome. But unfortunately, it's the wrong time of year to be doing this. And so he gets as far as Crete, and it's really not great weather for them to be sailing. But they've arrived at somewhere called Fairhaven. And Fairhaven, unlike its name suggests, is actually an exposed harbour. It's not a great place for a boat to actually stay over winter. See, if the storms come and it's an exposed harbour, there might be damage. So the men think, the sailors are thinking, right, we need to find a better place to shelter for the winter. But Paul says, based on God's warnings, if you do this, disaster and shipwreck are ahead. And lo and behold, they get hit by a really bad storm and suddenly get blown off course. The circumstances right now are dire, and they are entirely out of Paul's control. He cannot control what's going on around him. But he knows this one thing, that God has said, you are going to go to Rome. You are going to preach for me there. And so he has this anchor of hope. And do not underestimate the power of hope in your life based on the promises of God. If you're in the bad times, find the promises of God and cling on to them. If you are in the better times, then search for God's promises in your life and hold on to them, because they are going to be like an anchor. Internalize them, because they are going to be hope when the bad things happen. You see, the circumstances, the devil cannot take your peace, your hope, or your faith unless you surrender them, but he can affect the circumstances. Yes. And you know what? This is our version of perfection. Perfection for us is like this. We arrange the environment around us to suit us, so everything works, everything goes right first time, nothing goes wrong. If you've ever thought, if I was in charge, this is how I would do it. And the way that we describe that is that we would just make it all right. And we kind of envisage that perfection should be that all the circumstances around us must be ideal for us. But God's got a different opinion. You see, the way that God does it is differently. And the reason is this, because if we do it our way, we never learn, we never grow. And it goes like, and God gets none of the glory. Just imagine it like this. Who amongst you likes the idea of passing an exam? Yeah? We pass a test, it's great. But if the test was for play schoolers and we passed that, it's kind of like, oh, well, what was the point? Yeah? Because it was too easy. Or imagine the national football team that you support wins their match against Ferndown's under-11 team. Where's the glory in that? Why did I bother watching? Of course they were going to win. So if we do it our way, where everything is ideal, then God gets none of the glory. No, this is God's version. He takes us along the best pathway through the circumstances. The circumstances, yes, he's got the power to change them, but it's actually harder to take an imperfect person through imperfect circumstances along the best route. And as we do that, we grow and we mature. Our faith develops, and we get to the end of it, and we think, wow, I would never have made it through that if God hadn't taken me through it. It must have been God. And so God gets all the glory. To us, circumstances are an obstacle, but to God, they're an opportunity. The enemy can manipulate circumstances, but God wields them like a skilled craftsman, brandishing a tool used to carve and shape us if we would only let him. Be more like the tree and let God bring the goodness in the midst of the storm. You see, Paul right now is subject to the decisions of others. It says, but the weather changed abruptly, and the winds of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. Somewhere along the line, Paul is somewhere like there, roughly, out into sea. I did a little bit of a calculation and worked out, okay, there is Malta, taking into account, being able to see it on the horizon and such like. If you were about there and you try and aim to get through that gap there, because this is the way the wind's blowing, what were the chances of actually landing on Malta And I reckon they're about 100,000 to 1. I did the maths. Roughly about 100,000 to 1. If you take that gap there and the width of the ship and trying to fit through that gap, that sort of odds. And actually, it's really important that they landed on Malta. Malta is a small island. If prisoners get shipwrecked on an island, then the prisoners can't escape. If they got shipwrecked on the mainland, they could, and the first instinct of the Roman commander would be to kill them all, sooner than them actually escaping. But because they're on an island, he lets them live because they've got nowhere to go. If they tried to escape, he would find them. And so they're on an island. And eventually, Paul, he did some things on the island. He almost certainly evangelized, because let's face it, it's Paul. And eventually, he gets to Rome, and the gospel is preached in Rome, just as God said, because the storm was mighty, but God's ability to steer the ship was mightier. And you know what? Being blown out to sea feels hopeless, or it can do. But find God's promises and hold on to them, because our hope is our salvation in Jesus. But our hope to endure these days is his Spirit and his promises, and our faith is to act in obedience according to an authentic belief in him, what we actually believe, and in his goodness. Be like the tree that allows God to bring what he wants. Because you know what? It is hard following Jesus. It is a challenge. But sometimes we make it a whole lot harder than it needs to be. Because we deny the help that God is longing to bring to us because we want to do it ourselves. Become the mighty oak that he said you will. Because trees endure. And all this takes training, and training takes discipline. And you know what? That's exactly how it's supposed to be, because God made it that way on purpose. I'm done here. I'm just going to hand over to JJ, and he's going to finish off the service. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dan.